morning, all of you. My name is Wendy Rohleder-Sook, and I'm the Department Chair at the Department of Communication Studies, Law, and Political Science. Also one of your speakers today. I want to thank you all for coming out to the last American Democracy Project Times Talk for the year. It's been a fantastic year of lots of really great programs, and I know many of you have been to many of them, so thank you for your support of that. Today we're going to talk about legal deserts and understanding the crisis in rural parts of America, including Kansas, and the shortage of attorneys who are practicing in our areas. So I'm first going to introduce myself, and then I'm going to give my co-presenters a chance to introduce themselves as well. But I do want to, I guess, preface that with that we are all members of a statewide committee on the Kansas Rural Justice Initiative. So much of what we're going to talk about today is included in the report that our committee put together about this issue. So again, my name is Wendy, and I serve on the committee as kind of a member of the education community in thinking about how we address this issue. So I'm going to ask my co-presenters to introduce themselves.
I'm Ashley Comeau. I also teach here at Fort Hays. I teach American Civil Liberties every spring. I am full-time an attorney at Jeter Law Firm here in Hays. I also have a remote office in Plainville, Kansas, just north of here where I live. I am an alumni of Fort Hays State University. I attended Fort Hays, studied political science, and ran track and field here for 4 years. So it's exciting to be here and exciting to be able to teach and give back to Fort Hays a little bit.
My name is Aaron Cunningham. I am the Ellis County Attorney, and I was on the subcommittee for, I call it the Wooing People Subcommittee for recruitment and retention and just trying to get people interested in rural practice. In addition to being the Ellis County Attorney, I'm an adjunct professor. I think it's a pretty generous term to say I teach students, but I do meet with students in a class setting every Tuesday and try to make them not fall asleep terribly. So, but yeah, primarily my practice has been exclusively criminal law on the prosecution side of things, and so I'm happy to be a part of this and just kind of share some of what I've experienced, difficulties and success stories I have with getting people to come out and do law in western Kansas and some of the programs that have really helped us overcome these obstacles.
Thank you both. I don't know if you both mentioned you're both from this area. So they are really great examples of folks who pursued law, got the degree, and then came back to serve their home communities in the practice of law. So that's an area that we'll talk about in some of the solutions to address this issue. But first, I guess we did introductions already. So we're going to talk about the Kansas Rural Justice Initiative Committee, what it was and what its task was. We'll spend some time identifying the problem, so I want to give you some statistics and numbers about what the landscape looks like. And then we'll talk about some of the barriers that our committee identified to practicing in rural Kansas, and we'll weave in that conversation the recommendations that our committee made to address those issues. So our Rural Justice Initiative Committee was created by the Kansas Supreme Court, and Marla Lukert, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in administrative order, put together a committee in December of 2022 to talk about this issue of the shortage of attorneys in rural Kansas. That, I think those conversations had been taking place in rural areas, but they were also hearing from judges in those districts in terms of what impact that was having on their court. And specifically, sometimes that came in the form of not having enough criminal defense attorneys to appoint to criminal defendants who have a right to counsel. But that also included folks who weren't able to handle their regular legal matters, whether that could be things like estate planning or divorce or business transactions. So this group was put together and was composed of a large kind of swath of people in Kansas. It included people from all branches of the government, so the judicial, the legislative, and the executive branches were all represented. Folks from the education sector, which included myself, as well as folks from Washburn Law School and the KU School of Law. Lots of community members, those who were interested in rural economic development, as well as other sort of statewide commerce initiatives. And then also a lot of rural attorneys. So folks with me today are great examples of the perspectives that we got from people who were on the ground practicing in rural areas, who could speak to the challenges that they were facing, perhaps in their practice, but also in not having enough federal attorneys to handle the load. So let's talk about the problem first. So first, our committee had to decide what rural was. We had a lot of conversations about that. We talked about frontier areas and rural areas and how rural was really rural. And we ended up with a definition basically that said, we're going to consider all counties in Kansas except for the 5 most populous counties as rural for the purposes of this work. So that excluded Douglas, Johnson, Sedgwick, Shawnee, and Wyandotte counties, where we see our largest population centers. Everything else we consider to be rural. So in the data that we collected, and Ashley was the co-chair and part of our data collection committee, so they put together a lot of our statistics, looked at, first to start with, what our population in Kansas looks like and how that then compares to the attorney population. So in Kansas, about 45% of people live in rural areas, so they live outside of those populous counties. 55% live in the urban areas. But when we look at the active attorney population, we only see about 20%, 21% attorneys practicing and living in those rural areas, compared to 80% of those in urban areas. One of the other findings that we included in the report, one of the stats I think that was pretty shocking to a lot of us, was that there were more Kansas attorneys practicing in Missouri than there were in all rural areas in Kansas. So that's a pretty striking statistic. So we broke that down by county, so you can see really kind of the counties that are in the most dire of straits. Those counties that are in the darkest color have more attorneys. They have at least more than 100 attorneys. Those counties that are light in color, some of them have, the lightest color, they have 1 to 3 attorneys. 14 counties fall into that category. And then we have 2 counties that have no attorneys. So those that are white with the red dots have 0 attorneys in those counties. Yeah.
So one thing that I would like to add to that, on the last slide especially, oh, we're jumping forward, okay. So one thing that came out of the data subcommittee was even these numbers are skewed. Because when you look at, let's see here, Ellis County here and Rooks County above it, 2 that I have personal knowledge of, most of those attorneys that are still registered and still actively licensed attorneys, they work in-house somewhere, and so they're not actually taking clients. They teach. The judges were all counted in that, and so you have a large number of counties that show they may have 4 to 10 attorneys, when in reality, you maybe have 2. And those 2 attorneys are very unavailable because we are swamped. So that's also a little bit misleading, as dire as that looks. It's worse than that. Sorry, it's not going to be all bad news today, I promise. We're going to get to solutions. This graph then shows attorneys per 1,000 residents. That's how a lot of the national statistics look at how many attorneys can service 1,000 people in your population. So again, you see something pretty similar, but there's a lot that are in the shaded area, which means that they have 1 or fewer attorneys per 1,000 residents to handle affairs. Now, we know that not all people need attorneys all the time, but it's likely that everyone will need an attorney at some time. So these numbers are not great, and they do get a little worse here. And when we're looking at the ages of attorneys, so the median age of attorneys in the United States is 46 years old. In Kansas, it's 51, so we're already starting at a higher number in the state.
That's consistent with what the urban attorney population looks like, but when you look at the rural population, they're older. They're 55 is the median age. So we not only have fewer attorneys, the ones that we do have are aging. So this graph shows kind of the age ranges and the number of attorneys, and you can see 2,400 of the attorneys in Kansas are 60 or older, which likely means that within the next probably 10 to 15 years, I would say, attorneys do tend to retire later than many other professionals do, that in the next 10 to 15 years, those folks will move out of the practice of law, and you can see our small number in the 21 to 35 range is pretty small, or not large enough to fill those gaps that are going to be left by the attorneys who will be leaving. So this graph, again, is attorney per 1,000 residents, but it takes out those who are over 60. So again, that population that is likely to, attorneys who are likely to move out of the practice, then create even larger gaps, where you see several counties then in this that will have 0 attorneys per 1,000 residents when we take out those who are 60 and older. So it's critical that we bring more people in to provide the supply that's needed to address legal issues. This graph shows the number of attorneys admitted in Kansas, which had been, on a good trajectory there until the mid-90s and has kind of slowly declined. You do see some dips there that will align with a graph that I'm going to show you about students going to law school and graduating from law school. It does look like at the end, maybe there's some hope there that we're seeing more attorneys admitted into Kansas. That looks like we're kind of on the upward trajectory, and hopefully that continues. But we've seen kind of a lot of difference in terms of students applying to law school. And I've got a number of students in here right now who may be in that category and thinking about law school. I do have a plug there. I do have a pre-law magazine back there, and I picked that one in particular because there is an article about rural attorneys adjusting the need there. Dr. Young has it in her hand, so please grab one of those. If you know people who would be interested, take one, because I have lots of copies. But this graph shows the number of applications to law school. So here we're just talking about people who might be interested in going to law school. Those numbers have fluctuated over time. We hit some peaks in the mid-2000s, which was the point that I was working in that area, which was fantastic. In 2008, what happened in 2008? The recession. Which pulled a lot of people out of law school because they were no longer finding jobs when they were graduating. The market was oversaturated, and law schools made a decision to pull back the numbers of students that they would admit, in part because they were getting small numbers of applications. So applications took a large hit. Law schools responded, they shrunk their class sizes, which meant that they probably also reduced offerings, reduced faculty members, etc., to kind of have the new size of law schools. And some say, well, they just need to admit more students now and it will all be okay. It's not quite that simple. We can have a whole discussion on that afterwards if you'd like to chat with me about the challenges of doing that to address the problem. You still need to have people who are interested in going to law school and qualified folks who can be admitted to law school and who will be prepared to sit and pass a bar exam to be able to practice law school when they graduate. So those numbers, I do have good news as of today. It looks like application numbers for this cycle for students who will be starting in fall of 25 have gone up pretty significantly. We don't know if that will continue, but the numbers right now are about up 20%, which is pretty substantial. But we've kind of been up and down since about COVID. It hasn't been a consistent increase trajectory there for that. And this graph just shows law school graduates, so it's going to mirror what you see kind of with applications, the number of grads that are actually turning out. This from KU and from Washburn, that has just slowly decreased from 2010, 2011. Okay, now I'm turning it over to these folks to talk about barriers. So we're going to talk about financial, practice, and cultural barriers. That's kind of what our committee grouped these barriers into, and Ashley's going to talk about financials.
Okay. Which one goes forward? The one. Okay. Financial barriers. Don't let any of this convince you not to go to law school. But there are concerns. So one of the things that I felt like was most important to me in my role on this Rural Justice Initiative Committee, as one of the few young people, I would say there were 4 of us under the age of 40 on the committee. We were selected and appointed by the Supreme Court, and I do think that our age group was probably represented in alignment with attorneys in rural Kansas. And maybe that was intentional, maybe not. But I felt like my role on the committee was to scream from the rooftops that the #1 issue was education debt. And I don't know that I was entirely taken seriously, which I've had many conversations with Wendy about, because there are many factors that contribute to why a young person doesn't want to come back to rural Kansas or rural America in general, for any profession, including the practice of law. But the most important reason is financial reasons. Aaron might disagree with me slightly, but I think that overall, the most important reason would be education debt. And I felt like my role was to really convince the committee that was working on the proposed legislation to address that. So here are some of the facts. Again, don't let this convince you not to go to law school and not to come back, because there is hope. But 74%, so 3 out of 4 rural attorneys graduated with at least some student loan debt. And as someone who headed up the data collection committee, I will tell you some student debt is significant. I was fortunate to go to Fort Hays like you. I left Fort Hays with less than $20,000 in total debt. It's something that I have now, if I had only graduated with Fort Hays debt, I would have paid back now more than 3 times over. However, because then I went on to law school in 2008, I was pulled into a room shortly after I started law school with a few other students, and I was told, hey, remember that scholarship you came into law school on? We don't have money for it anymore. Unfortunately, your scholarship was invested in government bonds, and there is no money for that. So a lot of us took on more debt, especially I think from 2008 up until here about recently. We saw in the data a pretty significant increase from about 2008 until about 2018, which is your entire decade of, attorneys, young people. And so some student loan debt really means 6 figures. That's what it means. More rural attorneys are definitely borrowing money to finance their education. A lot of us don't come from a similar background as kids who come out of the more urban areas. So our parents aren't attorneys, our parents aren't doctors, our parents are farmers and work in, blue collar jobs, and that means that we have to take on a little more debt than others. So what I also found, and this is really interesting, only 26% of rural attorneys who graduated before 1980 had student loan debt. Several conversations that I had in person on the committee alone, they said, well, I had student loan debt. And I asked one of the judges on the committee, I said, well, what was your student loan debt, if you don't mind me asking? $5,000. That was not my experience. The amount of money that rural attorneys are borrowing is significantly higher than in prior years, and it's just a fact of life. School is just more expensive now, and that's the way that it is. So again, the average before 1980 was $12,200 in total debt, and after 2011, $124,614, which I think that is really spot on. I mean, that number really is about where we came in on that data collection committee. The way that we collected the data, we sent out surveys to all practicing attorneys in the state of Kansas, and we actually had a pretty good turnout. And they submitted, mostly it was multiple choice. Where they could select like ranges of answers, but we did allow them to actually provide feedback as well. And I felt like a lot of the feedback came to us in the form of comments on their student loan debt, and there were many that were much higher than $125,000, because by the time you combined with your undergraduate student debt, it was much, much higher. I was surprised by how many were over $200,000, to be honest with you. So it's a real issue and it needs addressed. So because of this debt, new attorneys are postponing major life decisions longer. I did not get married until I was in my 30s. I know many of my classmates did not do that. Many people don't buy a home as early as we used to, which means you have that debt longer in life, and there are a number of other things that that play into that education debt, really impacting your ultimate career choice and what you can do with your degree. That also means that attorneys are choosing jobs in urban markets. That's exactly what I did. I graduated law school out of Washburn. Here I was from Rooks County. My whole life I lived in Rooks County, came to Fort Hays, went to Washburn. Never once did I consider rural practice. It just was not going to be for me. I got a certificate in law and government. While I was at Fort Hays, I worked for the State Department. I had an internship with the press office at the U.S. Mission to the UN. I cried the day I left and had to come back to Hays because that's what I wanted to do. My first big girl job out of law school was with a firm in Kansas City. Loved it. And then I met a boy. And he convinced me to come back to Western Kansas. And there are other attorneys in this room who have a similar story. That you wind up in rural Kansas because of a number of other factors in life choices. So when I initially came back, I came back as an in-house counsel for a company that worked worldwide. It was very exciting, and ultimately I ended up in the practice of law that I'm in, which is a general civil practice. And I have to tell you, it is the most rewarding work I have ever done in all of the jobs and various things that I've worked in. This practice means a lot to me, and I think that there is something to be said for knowing your clients, knowing or learning their life story, and helping them when they really need it. Because most of these rural clients come to you because they have some emergency, and there's something that they need help with, and it's very not just rewarding, but it's very meaningful to be able to help people in that way. And when you work in the city and you work in an urban job with a slightly higher starting salary, that is fair. I still do not make the amount of money that I made in Kansas City. But in Kansas City, I worked for a partner. That was my client. I did a ton of research. I did a lot of discovery review. I, from time to time, got to meet a client at their deposition, but I didn't know my clients. And here I know them, and I know their family, and I know what I'm doing when I am helping them. So that, I think, is just my perspective, but they're choosing urban practice for the money, and I just want to make sure that I'm really clear that I had the same experience. I was making more money in Kansas City, but it's not necessarily as impactful over the span of a lifetime to take that higher paying job. So the employment rate was the highest since 1987. I, again, because I started law school in 2008, had the experience in 2011 that the jobs just were not there. The internships all went away while I was in law school, and you had to really grovel and get online and find something to do. So it's encouraging to see that the employment rate is going up. National law firm salaries for the class of 2022 averaged $145,000. Of course, in Kansas, that is not going to be the case. And in rural Kansas, that's not necessarily going to be the case. But frankly, I mean, roughly $75,000 in rural Kansas is absolutely something that you can make out here, and that is a decent salary out here. And the great thing about rural Kansas is that your salary at a rural practice is entirely what you can make it. So I think that these numbers are really pretty fair for rural Kansas, actually. Even though it says they reported a mean salary of $59,000, I think that there's a lot of give and take with that, especially if you go into private practice. There are a lack of benefits at law firms, especially private firms, because benefits are expensive. They are very expensive to provide. We do fortunately have the marketplace now that is available. Most of the attorneys I know are on a spouse's plan, frankly. That's my situation. My husband works for Ellis County and I'm on his benefits plan. I know other attorneys at our firm have spouses that work at Fort Hays or work at various places around town, and they're on those benefit plans. So that is something to think about, and there are good reasons for that. So ultimately, what came out of our Rural Justice Initiative was we made 2 recommendations as a whole when we went to the legislature this spring session. The first one was that we should collaborate to establish a rural attorney training program
And it would start with students who go into law school, and that they would create tuition reimbursement incentives to encourage those attorneys to come back and practice in rural Kansas. There are some programs, I should back up a second, there are some programs that are similar to this that already exist with Washburn. And I think that those are really worth mentioning, just because if you are willing to come back and practice in one of the Dangy Hansen Foundation counties, and I think it's now been expanded to the Patterson Family Foundation as well for other rural counties, you can really minimize your law school debt if you would just consider the rural practice programs that they have, especially for the Third Year Anywhere program. So if you haven't heard of those things, you should definitely look into it, because it is a way to get a law degree and get a lot of really practical experience in a rural community, and then go on and do whatever it is you may want to do with your career. Hopefully it's to stay in rural Kansas, but even if it's not, it is a great way to reduce that ultimate law school student debt burden. I'm going the wrong way now. The other recommendation, this is one I was a big supporter for, was that the Kansas Supreme Court and the Kansas Legislative Branch should really work to establish a student loan repayment program for attorneys who are already living and practicing in rural Kansas. And the reason for that is we already see a much smaller number of attorneys who are in that 30 to 40 age range, or 25 to 40 age range, that are already out here practicing. And we're getting by, and we're figuring it out, but we still have 6 figures in student debt. And when you're working on a public service loan forgiveness program that you may or may not ultimately get forgiveness for, that's always up in the air, or you're working on an income-based repayment program plan, that could go away at any point in time. That's a little bit scary, but you don't even make enough on the payments to address the interest. So what happens is your student loan debt grows while you're paying on your student loan debt. And even though I've paid over $60,000 at this point, my total debt has not gone down. So addressing that, I think, will be huge, because we already have roots here. We have kids in school here, and we already have clients here who would be devastated if we left. But ultimately, when you get your kids raised, and now you're this experienced attorney in your 50s, do you stay and continue to do this, or do you move on and go make some money and prepare for retirement? I mean, I think that's a really great question as to how many more attorneys we will lose if we don't address the ones who are already here and provide some sort of a student loan repayment program. And one of the things that we talked about with the legislature is this already exists for doctors. It exists to an extent for nurses and teachers. It exists for veterinarians. So why are we not doing this for attorneys when we have a real crisis on our hands? So that was the other recommendation that we made from a financial perspective to the Kansas legislature. Yes.
So, bids, the difference between, so if you're a public defender in a city where they have a public defender office, that's counted as public service and you can get your student loans forgiven. And my understanding is if you do bids, because there's not a public defender office, you cannot count that service as criminal defense.
I have heard that.
Well, it's true, I researched it.
Okay.
I would like some of this to be paid, right? And if you're a public, it says public defender, but they do not include bids in that program. Has there been any discussion about that with the legislature?
Not with the legislature directly.
Federal program.
Yeah, not with the legislature. So everything we have done has been with the Kansas legislature and just trying to form these programs that kind of build off of the Rural Opportunity Zone program. I took advantage of that program. It pays up to $3,000 per year over 5 years for a total of $15,000, which sounds like a decent amount of money toward your student debt, except what I kept trying to point out when I was on this committee was that $15,000 would be great if you gave it to me in a lump sum and I could pay it towards my principal. But when you give it to me over 5 years in $3,000 increments, it doesn't even address the full interest. So it's really just throwing the state's money down the drain, frankly. I'm appreciative because it helped keep my interest at bay, but that's all that it did. And we need something more impactful. So that's what the state legislature heard from us this year. Unfortunately, we didn't make it out of committee on the House or the Senate side, but there's a lot of talk about how can we really build this up and get it in front of the legislators again for next year. All right, it is Aaron's turn.
All right, well, you'll have to forgive me. I'm a peripatetic performer, and so I don't do the stand at the podium thing. All right, so we are at 12:05 for the last 35 minutes. You've heard all the wonderful problems we have in the legal community, and they've left me to try to address some of these. But first we're going to talk about more barriers, so that'll be great. So one of the things that a lot of rural attorneys deal with, obviously, is this professional isolation problem. So instead of going to a giant firm where you got 40 other people you can bounce ideas off of, or, go down the street and find 10 other attorneys, on the same block as the courthouse to ask questions to, out here we tend to be a little more isolated. I'm pretty fortunate being in the county attorney's office. I do have 2 or 3 other attorneys I can run ideas by. But what I see happen a lot with some of the young defense attorneys I come up against, they clearly, and I mean this totally kindly, have no clue what they're doing at all. And I catch myself silently, like, muting my mic and whispering to them, this is where you make your motion to have this dismissed. And then they're like, oh yeah, that thing that I heard about once in law school. And so that's a major barrier that we have, and as you can see from the numbers here, the vast majority of people in rural Kansas, they're kind of on their own. They don't have the mentorship opportunities that a lot of people in more urban areas would have. And so things like, one of the things I'll talk about in a minute here, like a rural specialty affinity group for those that are doing rural practice would be tremendously beneficial, so that they would have a community of people to bounce ideas off of, get best practices from, get basically document templates from, so that they know what a standard motion to modify bond looks like, so they know what a standard, subpoena or precipice should look like. Simple things like that. So, but that is an issue that we face. Going hand in hand with this, since there are a lot of solo practitioners or very small firms with 2 or less people, there's a lot of lack of business skills, and more importantly than that, it really cuts into the good they can do on the legal side of things. So a lot of these people can't afford to pay someone to just do their books for them. They can't afford to pay someone to do all of their time management of client meetings and stuff like that. And while there are softwares that do a great job of helping attorneys manage those things, as you can see, a lot of attorneys are spending 11 to 20 hours a week doing this type of administrative work. And so that's 11 to 20 hours, they're not billable hours. They can't pass those expenses on to their clients. They can't pocket money for that, they're just kind of out that time. What's really alarming is that there are people spending 21 to 30 hours. If you think about the standard work week for normal professions being a 40-hour work week, I mean, that's 3/4 of your time gone there. Now, most attorneys are workaholics and have major mental health issues, so they work much more than that. But still, that is a huge resource drain because they have to not only be an attorney, but they also have to be their own CFO and CEO and send out all the letters and send out all the billing, and that's a huge resource drain on the attorney's ability and time. So, what I am happy to report is there are a lot of misperceptions about rural practice, and I think that all of the people on the panel today can certainly speak to this in their own experience. But a lot of people assume if you're going out into rural Kansas, you're not going to have opportunities to have unique or interesting cases. That's simply not true. There's also a misconception that in rural Kansas you can't specialize and be kind of an expert in a very niche field. That's not true. We have people that do, intellectual property types of law, essentially. I'm not even educated enough to articulate what you do, Julie. Yeah, trademark, sure. Very niche, so niche I don't even know how to explain it. And I sat through an hour CLE where she tried to explain it to me, and I still don't get it. So anyway, but you can specialize out in rural Kansas. 57% of rural Kansas attorneys turn away clients 1 to 5 times per week. I'm surprised that's that low. Every single attorney I know and talk to are completely swamped. They can't handle any more referrals. A lot of the attorneys I deal with that are on the Board of Indigent Defense Services, they are spread across 5, 10, some people more than 10 counties traveling usually 6-hour round trips down to Finney County and back, and they're just completely overloaded with clients. And that means that they're turning away other opportunities to do work as well. So the good news is there's plenty of opportunity to get work and to get paid out here in western Kansas, because there aren't a lot of people that are willing to do it. So you can have a profitable enterprise in rural Kansas. Most common reasons for turning away clients are the issues outside of the area of expertise. Yes, that's true, but a lot of the time it's the time issue, because they're spending 20 hours a week doing administrative work, and then probably 20 hours windshield time driving all over rural Kansas, at least. Conflicts of interest, that is a huge problem we run into. Obviously in smaller communities, everybody tends to know everybody. You represent somebody on a divorce issue, and then down the road there's another issue with that person. Maybe their ex-wife now has an issue and they want to hire you. You've got conflicts issues. You have obligations to your current and former clients, and that can really limit who you can serve and represent. And that's a major problem when you're practicing in Trigo County and you're the only civil attorney out there under the age of 80, and who, you know, still has a firm grasp on reality and civility hasn't set in. But, you know, this is a major issue that we see, is the conflict of interest thing as well. So those are certainly some barriers. A recommendation that was proposed as part of this plan is, obviously we need to develop professional skills in these attorneys, have opportunities to collaborate on issues relating to recruitment and retention in rural attorneys. And so that's something that we're looking at a couple of different ways, one of which I'll talk about here in a minute. In support of that, as has been mentioned a few times in this presentation, this Rural Justice Initiative was established by the Kansas Supreme Court as an ad hoc committee, meaning that we were there for a limited time, for 18 months, to identify all the problems and come up with solutions. As we got towards the end of our work on this committee, we realized this isn't something that's going to be done in 18 months. This is an issue that's going to evolve and change as the culture and what's going on in the legal world changes and evolves. And so we need to have a standing committee that will continue to assess and reassess what are the needs for rural practitioners and what can we do to come alongside them and partner with them for success. Recommendation 5, this is imploring the Office of Judicial Administration to consider what they need to do to help support these rural areas as well. Talking about dedicating staff and personnel to come on board and help address some of these issues as well. Because this is being recorded for posterity, I'll keep my comments on that to a minimum. But if you want to know my thoughts on that, I'd be happy to discuss them out in the hall with you. Not might. But certainly something has to be done from the support of the Office of Judicial Administration. Something has to be done to try to combat these overwhelming issues. Recommendation 6 is that we should partner with pre-existing programs and entities out there. Ashley did a good job talking about like the rural opportunity zones and programs that offer some financial incentive. The Department of Commerce has the Rural Prosperity Office that were big contributors in the Rural Justice Initiative Committee, and looking at what are other ways that we can, looking even outside of just the legal field, find ways to help ease some of these burdens on rural attorneys. Then cultural barriers. So there are a lack of resources in rural areas. There's really not a great way to put that. I deal with this even in the criminal law side of things. You know, we don't have inpatient treatment facilities here in Hays, Kansas. We got to ship our people 90 miles down the road at least if they want to get the care that they need. We have limited opportunities for mental health resources here. We do have a lot of great things through High Plains and other agencies, but still not nearly the type of resources that one of the top 5 counties would have, like Johnson County or Sedgwick County. But even beyond these institutional resources, we have very real personal resources. If you can't find a place to live, or find a place that isn't falling in on itself in rural Kansas, then you're probably not going to come work here. Huge issue, and I think this extends even to more urban areas, but certainly we feel it in a big way here in rural Kansas, is childcare. I have friends that the moment that they find out they're pregnant, they're panicking, because they only have 9 months to try to get on some kind of a waiting list to figure out where they're going to put their kid when maternity leave runs up. And so that's a very real concern and issue. What do you do with your children? Healthcare concerns. Obviously, we're lucky here in Hays to have Hays Medical Center, but if you look at the other 100 rural counties out there, it's pretty slim pickings, and sometimes you're traveling a long, long way to get any kind of health care. Education, again, I think Hays, we're very fortunate here, but there are several places that the schools have been consolidated across 2 or 3 counties because there's just not enough youth to really support an education system, and that's a real concern. My generation and people younger than me are still, looking for some of the, what are the fun, cool things we can do. Obviously, there's some serious limits. Staring at cattle and cow tipping isn't everyone's idea of a great time. Driving up and down country roads, in the evening and watching the sunset, although romantic for me as a Hays native, is probably not the most appealing thing for somebody who grew up under the city lights of, Kansas City. So what do we do for fun? Sometimes I'm embarrassed to host people because I'm like, well, I'm not coming to Hays, what is there even to do in Hays? And then I give them a list of things, and then, they come. But, yeah. And then the lack of other professionals is obviously an issue too. Coming out here at 25 years of age as a young professional, I kind of found myself in a weird middle ground, right? So I wasn't a college kid, and I didn't really fit in with that crowd. I was going to be the creepy old guy. And at the same time, I wasn't, I didn't have children, so I didn't have that natural social in. And I didn't have a spouse to help me connect anything. And so, I was looking to things like the Hays Young Professionals Organization. And there are programs and community resources like that in a lot of rural communities, but certainly there aren't as many professionals as you find in urban places. So, cultural myths. This is something I want to address because this is something certainly that I've heard as well. Growing up, you always hear this idea of you're going to go off and you're going to get your education, you're going to go out into the world and you're going to do incredible things. And implicit in that statement is this idea of if you come back, you're a failure and a reject and you didn't make it. And so I refuse to believe that about myself because of cognitive dissonance, but also because I found myself to be more successful in many respects than a lot of my peers that I went to law school with. And I don't think that's anything to do with my intelligence or ability, but the opportunities that I have out here being uniquely positioned in a rural community where they would trust a young attorney like me to do it because there's nobody else around that can do it. Whereas in a big city, that type of business or that type of case may only go to an attorney who's been practicing for 20 or 30 years. So this whole myth of you're a failure if you return to rural is really insulting to me. I think that obviously you can be highly successful as a rural attorney and probably in a lot of ways more successful and probably have a better work-life balance than if you were in an urban area. Law students report that when they express an interest in rural practice, they're asked why, and they're told they're too smart. I am offended. I was never told that I was too smart for rural practice in law school, but I'm glad that I returned to do rural practice. I definitely sense an attitude from some of those in the law school setting that they want to push you to go to a big firm. And there are a lot of different motivations behind that. I'm sure some of it is their statistics because it looks good. If their students graduate and go to prestigious firms that have name recognition, I get that. But the reality is the place that you're needed and the place you can serve very well and develop very quickly as an attorney is in rural Kansas. Some of the smartest attorneys that I know are here in rural Kansas, and some of the biggest slack-jawed mouth breathers that I can't believe passed the bar exam work in the heart of Kansas City. And that is the honest truth, seriously. And I'm convinced the only reason they haven't been disbarred yet is because they're at a firm where they're having their hand held and they're being told, hey, if you do that, you won't be allowed to practice law anymore. And so, honestly, you probably have to have a degree of competence and intelligence to be a rural attorney that some civil attorneys don't, or not civil, sorry, some urban attorneys don't have, because you don't have the level of oversight. You're the one that's going to get to research the issue. You won't have some associate or some intern doing it for you. And so, in my experience, the brighter minds tend to go rural. And you can quote me. There are a lot of things you can't quote me on in this presentation, but that's one. Another recommendation is Kansas Supreme Court should support civics education programming. This is my favorite part. So I love interacting with young people because without young people, everyone dies and then the world is over. So we need you, and young people are important. And so engaging youth is very, very important for the future of the legal profession. Obviously, if you haven't been able to tell throughout this presentation, we're kind of in a bad way. And we need more attorneys. And so if you could help, that would be lovely. And the studies that we've looked at actually tell us that kids by the time, like as early as 3rd to 5th grade, are making decisions about what they think they want to do with their life. And certainly that changes, and a lot of people when they get to college, it changes. But that tells me that we need to be addressing people at a younger and younger age. Waiting until they're an undergrad taking a trial advocacy class is probably a little too late. Certainly you can make good headway there, but you'll have a bigger impact if you reach those kids at a younger level. And so the way we do things like that, and I think there's probably a slide about it later, is we celebrate things like Law Day, which is May 1st. Say it shares the same day as May Day. That's poetic. Sometimes it feels like we're going down in the legal profession. Anyway, but we celebrate things like Law Day by doing presentations at the middle schools. We celebrate things like Constitution Day in September, and we read the Constitution at the courthouse. These are ways we're engaging the youth and the next generation to get involved. They have programs where you will have students do mock trials and things like that over classic fairy tales. So. Another recommendation is the Supreme Court should encourage pre-law programming and rural outreach effort at Kansas universities. So obviously, the things that we're doing at the middle high school level, that can also translate into what we're doing in places like Fort Hays. That's things like trial advocacy classes, civil liberties classes, mock trial competition teams, which I have some interest in. If you're interested in that too, you should talk to me. But anyway. So obviously very important to pour into the next generation of lawyers. Support opportunities for outreach in rural Kansas communities during law school. These are things like the Hansen Foundation and the Patterson Foundation, where they are partnering financially and with programming for placement options for those that will serve as mentors. I did the Hansen program. I was in the inaugural class. I liked it so much, and apparently I failed it. They let me do it a second time. And that really is what led to me coming back to Hays. As I was placed here in Ellis County, I loved it so much I asked to do it for another summer. They let me do that. They gave me a $5,000 living stipend to do that. And here's the big one, they paid for 6 credit hours towards my education, which is a huge value if you can do math. I can't, but they told me it's a huge value. So, programs like that are so essential because it gives people practical boots on the ground exposure to a rural community if they don't come from one. Is this a place that I could actually see myself? And because of the Hansen program, so I'm a graduate of it, and I wound up out here. 4 of the current defense attorneys I work with regularly are graduates of that program, and then my assistant county attorney is a graduate of that program. The former assistant county attorney, who's now a defense attorney, was a graduate of that program. So it is making a major difference, at least here in Ellis County and other places in rural Kansas. Last recommendation, the Kansas Supreme Court should encourage rural attorneys to collaborate with professionals in grassroots efforts to support and sustain Kansas communities. So again, this issue isn't just unique to the legal profession. All professions are kind of facing this problem right now. And so the more we can work together and share best practices of how to address these underlying issues, the more successful we can be. So, finally, to your relief, I will stop talking and I will open up the floor to questions.
While we're getting questions, I'm passing around the final committee report. There's also, this gives an executive summary. You can get the full report there, the QR code in the back. And then if any of you know any high school students, speaking of, reaching out to K through 12, some of us are coordinating a Legal Minds Academy this summer as a one-day program. We'll have a location here in Hayes, one in Pittsburgh, and one in Garden City. That's a one-day program to introduce high school students to the legal profession. So feel free to take a couple of those if you know people who might be interested. Any questions?
I do have a question. So you talked a lot about recommendations. Did any of those stick? Did we get anything?
I think we're at the very front end of that. So the recommendations in the report, it was just released this year. And we just started presenting it to the legislature this year. And I worked for a lobbyist when I was in law school in Topeka, and one of the biggest things you learn when you get into Topeka and get exposed to that world is you have to go year after year after year before you really start to see change and before you start to see impact. So the main thing that I know of that has come out of this so far is that the Kansas Bar Association has formed a rural attorney subcommittee, and they're currently forming their board for that group, and so that professional organization is getting started and underway.
Yeah, and I would add to that, with the legislature, there did seem to be quite a bit of support among legislators for the program, although it did not move forward. There were no testimonies against the program. We had several, including Ashley, who testified for the bills. So I think we feel pretty good that it will come back to the legislature next year. And then the other piece is that Washburn Law School has created a Rural Justice Center, or expanded theirs, to hire staff. In fact, they're helping with the Legal Minds Academy, so they will be doing some program like that, as well as extending those externships with a grant that they got from the Patterson family across the state. So that will not just apply to the Hanson counties, but to across the state. So there is some movement on things, but the legislative piece.
And I think that the biggest impact, what is stuck, is the data that we collected during this 18 months, right? So you guys all saw on the line charts how huge the opportunity will be in the next 10 years for young people to step into these jobs that are going to be vacated quickly. So, for every, 4 or 5 attorneys that are retiring, there may only be one to take their spot. And I can tell you over and over and over again, this year alone, I have had clients come to me and say, my attorney retired, or I haven't visited with my attorney in 10 years, or I'm coming to you specifically because you're young, please don't go anywhere. And that was something that was said to me Monday. Please don't go anywhere, I'm coming to you because you're young and I want to make sure that you're our attorney. I was in back-to-back-to-back meetings all day Monday and all day yesterday. So there is a huge opportunity that is sitting here for a young person to come out here and really have a very busy career.
Any other questions? Yeah.
You noted a lot the 2008 recession and the effects it had on the legal career in Kansas. Do you expect similar results in coming because of our current economic situation?
I don't think it's as bad, honestly. I met with my financial advisor just on Monday, and he was showing me a chart of, this is where the market has gone over the last 20 years, and 2008 was significantly worse than anything that's happened since 2020.
Yeah, and I don't think that we're seeing the same thing in terms of law school placement, because prior to that recession, we had very high numbers of law school graduates, and they were just turning out more graduates than there were jobs that were available. Because they're not, they have a much better fit where we are right now, I don't think that we will see that. We still need attorneys, and I think we kind of alluded to this, but all states are dealing with shortages of attorneys in rural areas. States where you think the populations are really big, like New York, for example, had a report that we looked at. They're addressing the same sort of issues that we are with their rural areas.
Any speculation as to why we were turning out more attorneys back then than we needed as opposed to now? And could that have to do with law school was cheaper and loans were cheaper?
Yeah, could have
And now-
been, yeah.
Students don't want to take on those debts if
Right.
they can't pay them back.
It certainly was less expensive at that time, and we just had a lot of students applying to law school. I mean, at that point, there were about 100,000 who were applying to law school at the peak of it. Now we're hovering around 60,000, just to give you kind of frame of reference, how large we were compared to where we are now.
I just make a comment that, you know, living and working out here, even though some of us didn't come out here like, sure, super on purpose.
Julie is an attorney and works here at Fort Hays as well, just to preface your
Yeah,
comments.
so I think that there's a lot of opportunity to really look at your own personal values out here and determine how you want your life to look with this job. Because it's a really good way to, you can pick your, you know, practice area. I've done almost everything out here. And I've recently, 4 years ago, decided to niche down into that area that, you know, Aaron doesn't know what it is. But I've done everything out here, I've had that opportunity, I have kids, I homeschool my kids, right? I can make my life look like that if I want to, I have my own firm, I work the hours that I choose, which is sometimes 3 in the morning, but it's sometimes not, right? So I think that you have a unique opportunity that you don't have in the city, because I came from the city, to really explore out into anything that you're interested in and try anything. And there is so much support out here. I mean, I've also adjuncted because Wendy asked me, hey, do you want to adjunct, right? So being able to try everything and have a quality of life and make a decision like that's congruent to your values in this profession is really hard to do in the city, I think.
The practice of law is very flexible in rural Kansas or in rural America. It is very inflexible in the city. You know, you were at a desk and you were getting your job done and you were answering to your partners. Out here, the firm that I work for, just to give you one example, because I don't think it's the typical rural attorney experience, I came into a firm where I was the 6th attorney. I have 2 partners who I can call on for advice at any moment of the day who have 50+ years of experience. I have attorneys that are between them and I in age. I have an attorney who is younger than me who works in the same firm. And then when I came in, I proposed, hey, there isn't an attorney in Plainville where I live. I have this building that my husband and I own. I'd like to convert that into an office and I'd like to offer my services there at least once a week, and that's what I do. And so there are opportunities where you can find these small towns that don't have an attorney and still make it work, where you can come into a bigger metropolitan area like Hays or Salina or Dodge City and still have that busier practice with support while you're still providing services in a much smaller town. And I think that's really where the practice of law is going, is there's another young attorney who just left a practice in Hays that he's doing it from home, looking for an office, but it's so flexible. You can do so many things from different places in rural Kansas. And since 2020, with everything going even more so online and on Zoom, I could say since 2019, when I started at Jeter Law Firm, I've been in a courtroom twice. But I've been in a courtroom virtually over and over and over again. And so the practice of law has really become more and more flexible over time, and it really makes a rural practice more feasible, I think.
And I would say too, when you're in a rural setting, I can call her partners. I have called her partners. They've called me too, right? They're like, I have this intellectual property question, what the heck? I tell them, if I have a question, I know I can call Joe, which he's not in my firm, I'm by myself. But he's like, yeah, what do you need? You know, so I can do that with any of the attorneys in town, if they have a specialty.
So we are all very passionate about, I think, this issue and the work. So if they have time, we're happy to stick around for questions if you have them individually, but I know we're out of time, so I gotta wrap up. I do wanna take a minute to recognize the American Democracy Project and their fantastic year that they've had. One of our co-faculty directors, Dr. Young, is here. Thank you for all of your work. And we have 2 fantastic student coordinators, and in recognition of Student Employment Week this week, Miriam and Madison, thank you very much for all of your work with the American Democracy Project. It's been a fantastic year with great programs like this, and I know 2 of you won't be with us next year, but we look forward to providing lots of great programming again next year. So thank you all for coming. Thanks for the great conversation, and if you want to stick around a little bit and chat with us, we'd be happy to do that. So thank you all.